Sometimes the person who saves you is the one person you should be running from. The neon beer signs cast an eerie red glow through the rain-streaked windows of Murphy's Roadhouse, somewhere between Billings and nowhere, as Sarah Chen clutched her coffee cup with trembling hands. She'd driven 8 hours through the Montana storm to escape the suffocating memories of her broken engagement, only to walk straight into her worst nightmare. Marcus, her controlling ex-fiancé, sitting 3 tables away with his arm wrapped possessively around another woman's shoulders. The same predatory smile that once fooled her now flashed in her direction, and Sarah knew he'd spotted her the moment she walked in. Panic clawed at her chest as Marcus whispered something to his companion and began to stand, that familiar look of ownership creeping across his face. In desperation, Sarah's eyes landed on a lone figure at the bar, a man in worn leather with Death's Door MC emblazoned across his back, nursing a whiskey like he carried the weight of the world. She had no idea that approaching him would thrust her into a web of federal investigations, organized crime, and deadly secrets that would change everything she thought she knew about trust, love, and survival. What happens when the safest place you can find is in the arms of the most dangerous man in the room? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's feet moved before her mind could catch up, carrying her across the scarred wooden floor of Murphy's Roadhouse like she was sleepwalking towards salvation or disaster. The storm outside hammered against the windows with increasing fury, but nothing could drown out the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The man at the bar didn't look up as she approached, his weathered hands wrapped around a tumbler of amber liquid. Up close, she could see the intricate details of his leather vest, patches that told stories she couldn't read, worn edges that spoke of countless miles on dangerous roads. His dark hair fell slightly over his collar, and when he finally lifted his head to meet her gaze, she was struck by eyes the color of storm clouds, intelligent and guarded in a way that didn't match the outlaw image. "I'm sorry to bother you," Sarah heard herself saying, her voice barely audible over the jukebox playing some mournful country ballad, "but I need your help." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her rain-dampened cardigan, the way she clutched her purse like a lifeline, the barely contained panic written across her features. "Lady, you sure you got the right guy?" Behind her, she could hear Marcus's voice carrying across the bar, that smooth tone he used when he wanted something. The same voice that had once convinced her she was overreacting when he showed up at her apartment uninvited, that she was being dramatic when he suggested she quit her job at the children's hospital because the hours interfered with their relationship. "Please," she whispered, stepping closer to the stranger. "My ex is here, and he won't leave me alone. If he thinks I'm with someone, maybe he'll back off." The biker's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something that might have been recognition flickering in those grey eyes. "What's it worth to you?" Sarah fumbled with her purse. "I can pay you." "Keep your money." His voice was rough velvet, carrying an authority that made her spine straighten involuntarily. "What's your name?" "Sarah Chen. Jake." He drained his whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate care. "How dangerous is this ex of yours, Sarah Chen?" The question caught her off guard. Marcus had never hit her. His methods were far more subtle, the constant criticism disguised as concern, the isolation from friends who weren't good enough for them, the way he made her feel like she was losing her mind, questioning her own memories and instincts. "He's not violent," she said finally. "He's just persistent. He doesn't like to lose." Jake's jaw tightened. "Men like that can be the worst kind." Before she could ask what he meant, a familiar voice cut through the ambient noise of the bar like a blade. "Sarah? Jesus, what are the odds?" She turned to see Marcus approaching, his politician's smile perfectly in place. Even in casual clothes, expensive jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than her monthly rent, he looked like he belonged on a campaign poster. Successful, charming, utterly convinced of his own importance. "Hello, Marcus." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. You look good, babe. Different, but good. His eyes swept over her appreciatively, as if she were still his to appraise. What brings you to a place like this? This isn't really your scene. Sarah felt Jake's presence behind her before his arm slipped around her waist, warm and solid and reassuring in a way that made her breath catch. "She's with me." Marcus's smile flickered, his gaze moving to Jake with poorly concealed distaste. "And you are?" "Someone who doesn't like repeating himself." Jake's voice carried a quiet menace that made the hairs on Sarah's arms stand up. She'd asked for help from a stranger, but suddenly she wondered if she'd just traded one dangerous situation for another. "Right." Marcus's laugh was forced. "Well, Sarah, when you're done with your adventure, give me a call. We should catch up properly, somewhere more appropriate." He leaned closer, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. "You know you don't belong here, sweetheart. This isn't you." The dismissive certainty in his voice triggered something in Sarah she'd forgotten she possessed. Anger, pure and bright and cleansing. "You don't get to tell me who I am anymore, Marcus. We're done. We've been done for 6 months. "Have we?" His eyes glittered with familiar condescension. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're acting out because I moved on first. This whole thing," he gestured vaguely at Jake, "it's beneath you." Jake's arm tightened around her waist. "Walk away. Now." Something in his tone must have penetrated Marcus's arrogance, because he took a step back, hands raised in mock surrender. Sure, no problem." He looked at Sarah one last time. "When you come to your senses, you know where to find me." As Marcus retreated to his table, Sarah realized she was trembling, not with fear this time, but with adrenaline. For the first time in years, she hadn't backed down. "Thank you," she whispered to Jake. His grey eyes searched her face. "Don't thank me yet." The meaning behind Jake's warning hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Sarah wasn't sure she wanted to understand. She remained acutely aware of his arm around her waist, the solid warmth of him that made her feel both protected and dangerously off balance. "I should go," she said, though she made no move to step away. Across the bar, Marcus sat with his blonde companion, their heads bent together in conversation that kept drifting in her direction. Even from a distance, she could read his body language, the tight set of his shoulders that meant he wasn't finished with this encounter. "Probably," Jake agreed, but his arm didn't loosen. "Storm's getting worse, though." As if summoned by his words, thunder crashed overhead, followed immediately by a flash of lightning that illuminated the rain-streaked windows. Sarah winced. She'd driven here in her aging Honda Civic, following back roads she barely knew in her desperate need to escape. The idea of navigating those winding mountain passes in this weather made her stomach clench. "I'll wait it out," she decided, then hesitated. "Would you mind if I stayed here? At the bar, I mean. Just until Marcus leaves." Jake studied her face with those penetrating grey eyes. "You always run to dive bars when life gets complicated?" The question stung because it was so far from the truth. 6 months ago, the most rebellious thing in Sarah's life had been choosing vanilla latte over plain coffee. Her world consisted of 12-hour shifts at Rocky Mountain Children's Hospital, her cramped apartment with its collection of medical journals and half-finished knitting projects, and the occasional dinner with her friend Lisa when Marcus hadn't found reasons for her to cancel. "This isn't exactly normal for me," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty with this stranger. I don't approach random men in bars. I don't even go to bars. What do you do?" "I'm a pediatric nurse." The words came out like a confession. "I work with kids who have cancer, mostly. It's—" She paused, searching for a way to explain how much her job meant to her without sounding like a saint or a martyr. "It's the only place I feel like myself anymore." Something shifted in Jake's expression, a softening around his eyes that seemed at odds with the dangerous image he projected. "Kids are lucky to have someone who cares." Sarah thought of her patients, brave little warriors fighting battles no child should face, their parents holding on to hope with desperate fingers. Tomorrow was Monday, which meant she'd be back in her scrubs, checking vitals, administering medications, reading stories to kids too sick to play. The thought of returning to that sterile, fluorescent world felt both comforting and suffocating. "I used to think nursing was enough," she found herself saying. "My career, helping people, Marcus always said I was too focused on work, that I used it to avoid living my real life." Maybe he was right about that part. What's your real life supposed to look like? The question caught her off guard. For 3 years, her real life had been Marcus's vision, the perfect fiancé to complement his political aspirations, someone who could host dinner parties and look good in photographs, whose own ambitions were small enough to fit around his larger ones. He'd painted pictures of their future with such certainty. The house in the suburbs, the country club membership, the strategic career move to a less demanding nursing position that wouldn't interfere with their social obligations. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. "I thought I did, but sitting here now, I realize I haven't made a single decision for myself in years. Even coming to Montana was about running away from something rather than running toward anything." Jake signaled the bartender for another whiskey. "What brought you to Montana?" "My grandmother left me a cabin. About an hour north of here. Sarah had inherited the property 6 months ago, the same week she'd finally found the courage to break her engagement. She'd never met her grandmother. A falling out between her parents had severed that connection before Sarah was born, but somehow this strange inheritance had felt like a lifeline. I thought maybe I'd spend the weekend there, figure out what to do with it, clear my head. Sounds peaceful." "Lonely," Sarah corrected, then flushed at her admission. "I'm not used to being alone. Marcus always said I needed people around me, that I got too anxious on my own." Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sounds like Marcus said a lot of things." The truth of that statement hit her like a physical blow. Marcus had narrated her entire existence, from her wardrobe choices to her career goals to her emotional responses. Standing here in this roadhouse, feeling more like herself than she had in years, Sarah realized how thoroughly she'd disappeared into his version of who she should be. "He did," she whispered, the weight of 3 lost years settling on her shoulders. Outside, the storm raged on, and Sarah Chen began to understand that some tempests were internal, requiring more than shelter to weather. The moments stretched between them, heavy with Sarah's admission and the growing intensity of the storm outside. She stared down at her untouched beer, watching condensation bead on the amber bottle, when the sound of familiar laughter cut through the bar's ambient noise like fingernails on a chalkboard. Sarah's head snapped up to see Marcus approaching the bar again, but this time he wasn't alone. The blonde woman from his table walked beside him, her manicured hand resting possessively on his arm, a diamond ring catching the dim light. A ring Sarah recognized with a sick jolt of realization. It was her ring, the 3-carat Tiffany solitaire Marcus had chosen for their engagement, the one she'd thrown at him the night she finally found the courage to leave. He'd had it resized. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Brittany." Marcus's voice carried across the space between them with deliberate volume, designed to ensure everyone in the vicinity could hear. "Brittany, this is my ex, Sarah Chen, the one I told you about." Brittany's smile was perfectly rehearsed, the kind of expression that said she'd heard every unflattering story Marcus had crafted about their relationship. "Oh, hi. Marcus has told me so much about you. You're the nurse, right? That's so noble." The condescension dripped from the word like honey laced with poison. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, that familiar sensation of shrinking under scrutiny that Marcus had always inspired. But then Jake's hand found hers, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both intimate and protective. "Congratulations," Sarah managed, proud that her voice didn't shake. "When's the wedding?" "December," Brittany gushed, lifting her hand to display the ring more prominently. Marcus wanted something special, something with history. He said this ring has tremendous sentimental value. The cruelty was so casual, so perfectly calculated that Sarah couldn't breathe for a moment. Marcus watched her reaction with the satisfied expression of a chess player who'd just achieved checkmate. He'd always been gifted at finding the exact words to destabilize her, But this felt different, more vicious, more personal. Sentimental indeed, Jake's voice cut through her paralysis, rough with an edge that made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. Amazing how some men recycle everything. Saves time, I guess. Brittany's smile faltered slightly. Excuse me? Nothing, Marcus interjected quickly, his politician's instincts recognizing dangerous territory. We should get back to our table. Enjoy your evening, Sarah. But as they turned to leave, Brittany's phone began buzzing insistently. She glanced at the screen, her face paling. Marcus, we need to go, now. What's wrong? It's about the campaign. Her voice dropped to an urgent whisper, but in the relative quiet of the bar, Sarah caught fragments. FBI investigation. Questions about the donations. Lawyers want to meet tonight. Marcus's face went ashen. For the first time since walking into the roadhouse, his composure cracked completely. That's impossible. We were careful. The shell companies... Not here, Brittany hissed, grabbing his arm. We need to leave, now. Sarah watched in stunned silence as Marcus, always so controlled, so certain of his invincibility, practically stumbled toward the exit. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough to shatter his carefully constructed facade. The door slammed behind them, leaving Sarah and Jake alone at the bar with the weight of what they'd just witnessed. Well, Jake said after a moment, his voice carefully neutral, that was interesting. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process what she'd overheard. Marcus worked in political consulting, specializing in campaign finance, a job that had always seemed legitimate, if boring. But the fear in his voice, the panic in Brittany's eyes, suggested something far more serious than campaign violations. I should go, she said suddenly, sliding off her bar stool. I need to get to the cabin, and with the storm... Jake's hand closed around her wrist, stopping her mid-sentence. Sarah, look at me. She met his grey eyes reluctantly, seeing something there that made her pulse quicken. Not attraction this time, but wariness. There was a calculation in his gaze that hadn't been there moments before, as if he was weighing decisions she couldn't begin to understand. That conversation you just overheard, he said carefully. Forget it. Whatever Marcus is mixed up in, you don't want any part of it. I don't understand. Trust me on this. Some secrets are dangerous to know. The gravity in his voice sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Sarah realized she was standing at a crossroads, though she couldn't see all the paths stretching before her. She could leave now, drive through the rain to her grandmother's cabin and pretend this night never happened. Or she could stay and ask the questions burning in her throat, questions about Marcus's panic and Jake's warnings and why a conversation about campaign donations had sent her ex fleeing into the night. The choice felt heavier than it should have, weighted with consequences she couldn't yet imagine. Sarah stared at Jake's hand wrapped around her wrist, her heart hammering against her ribs. The warmth of his touch should have been comforting, but something in his tone, the carefully measured cadence, the way he seemed to know more than he was saying, made every instinct she'd learned to trust as a nurse scream that she was missing something vital. Let me go, she said quietly, testing whether he would. He released her immediately, but his grey eyes remained fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. Sarah, I'm serious about this. Whatever you think you heard. I heard my ex-fiancé talking about shell companies and FBI investigations. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, her voice sharper than she'd intended. I heard him panic about something that made him run from a bar in the middle of nowhere during a thunderstorm. So don't tell me to forget it when you clearly know exactly what's going on. Jake's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. It was the same look she'd seen on doctors' faces when they were calculating how much truth a family could handle. You're right, he said after a long moment. I do know what's going on, which is why you need to stay as far away from this as possible. The admission sent a cold wave of fear through her chest. Who are you? Someone who's trying to keep you safe. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now. Sarah pressed her palms against the bar's scarred surface, needing the solid contact to ground herself. This was insane. 6 hours ago, her biggest worry had been whether she'd remembered to pack enough groceries for the weekend. Now she was standing in a roadhouse having cryptic conversations with a leather-clad stranger about her ex-fiancé's apparent criminal activities. "I need to think," she said, stepping back from the bar. "I need air. The storm." "I'll stay under the overhang." Jake didn't try to stop her this time, but she felt his gaze following her. She pushed through the heavy wooden door into the night. The covered porch offered little protection from the wind, but the sharp bite of cold air helped clear her head. She pulled out her phone, staring at the screen without really seeing it. The rational thing to do was call Lisa, her closest friend and the only person who'd consistently seen through Marcus's charm. But what would she say? That she'd impulsively approached a stranger for help and somehow stumbled into something that involved the FBI? That the man she'd been engaged to for 2 years might be involved in something serious enough to require shell companies and emergency meetings with lawyers? The Marcus she'd known, controlling, condescending, but ultimately focused on his image and career, didn't fit with the terrified man who'd fled the bar. But then again, she was beginning to realize how little she'd actually known about the man she'd nearly married. Thunder crashed overhead and Sarah flinched, her phone slipping from her wet fingers. As she bent to retrieve it, she caught a glimpse through the window of Jake still sitting at the bar, but now he was on his own phone, his posture tense, his free hand running through his dark hair in what looked like frustration. She couldn't hear his words over the storm, but his body language spoke volumes. This wasn't a casual conversation. This was the kind of urgent, low-voiced discussion she'd witnessed countless times in hospital corridors, the kind that happened when situations spiraled beyond anyone's control. Sarah straightened slowly, pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to complete clicking into place. Jake's immediate understanding of what Marcus's conversation meant, his warning about dangerous secrets, the way he'd appeared at exactly the right moment, as if her desperate need for help had been almost too convenient. A new possibility crystallized in her mind, one that made her stomach clench with fear and something that might have been betrayal. What if Jake's presence at the roadhouse tonight hadn't been coincidence? What if her desperate plea for help had inadvertently inserted her into something much larger and more dangerous than a chance encounter with her ex? She watched Jake through the rain-streaked window, noting details she'd missed in her earlier panic. The way he held himself, alert and controlled, even in casual conversation. The careful way he chose his words. The authoritative tone that suggested someone accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. Sarah Chen, who'd spent 3 years having her reality filtered through Marcus's perceptions, who'd been taught to doubt her own instincts until she barely trusted her own thoughts, felt a familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet. But this time, instead of the helpless confusion Marcus had cultivated, she felt something else rising in her chest, a fierce protective anger at being manipulated again. She pushed back through the door, water dripping from her hair, her decision crystallizing with each step. She was done being a pawn in other people's games. Jake looked up as she approached, his phone disappearing into his jacket pocket with practiced efficiency. The movement was too smooth, too automatic, the gesture of someone who'd learned to hide conversations as second nature. "Feel better?" he asked, but his eyes were already reading her expression, and she watched him tense as he registered whatever he saw there. "No." Sarah slid back onto her bar stool, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Actually, I feel like I'm being lied to. Again, Sarah." "Stop." She held up a hand, surprised by her own authority. "I've spent the last 3 years having people manage my reality for me, telling me what I should think, what I should feel, what I should know. I'm done with that." Jake's face remained carefully neutral, but she caught the flicker of something, respect, concern, in his grey eyes. "What do you want to know?" The simple question almost derailed her newfound resolve. She'd expected deflection, manipulation, the kind of verbal chess game Marcus excelled at. Direct honesty felt like stepping onto ice she wasn't sure would hold her weight. "I want to know who you are," she said. "Really. Not the mysterious stranger routine, not the protective warnings. I want to know why you understood exactly what Marcus was talking about, why you're carrying yourself like law enforcement, and why your presence here tonight feels a lot less like coincidence than you want me to believe." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her stomach clench. "You're right about the coincidence part." The admission hit her like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting it. "So what, then? You've been following me? Watching me?" He shook his head firmly. "I've been watching Marcus. You walking into that bar tonight asking for my help, that was the worst possible timing for both of us." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly, the way it had during her first week of nursing school when she realized the theoretical knowledge from textbooks meant nothing when facing actual human crisis. "You're investigating him. I can't—" "Don't you dare." The words came out harder than she'd intended, fueled by months of suppressed anger. "Don't you dare tell me what I can or can't handle. I'm a pediatric oncology nurse. I watch children fight for their lives every day. I think I can manage the truth about my ex-fiancé." Jake stared at her for a moment, and she saw him make some internal calculation, weighing risks she couldn't begin to understand. Finally, he nodded. "Federal investigation. Your ex is involved in something that goes well beyond campaign finance violations." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that made her throat dry. "How involved?" "Deep enough that his panic tonight could compromise an 18-month investigation." 18 months. Sarah's mind raced backward, trying to reconcile this timeline with her memories of Marcus. 18 months ago, they'd been planning their wedding, arguing about venue choices and guest lists. He'd been stressed about work, pulling long hours, taking phone calls at odd times, behavior she'd attributed to the demands of a growing consulting business. "The phone calls," she said suddenly. "Late at night, early mornings. He said it was clients in different time zones. Probably not clients." Sarah thought about the man who'd shared her bed, her plans, her future. The man who'd convinced her that her instincts were wrong, that her concerns were paranoia, that her desire for transparency in their relationship was unrealistic and demanding. How much of his life had been hidden from her? How much danger had she been living in without knowing it? "I could have been—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the implications too overwhelming. "You're safe," Jake said firmly. "You've been out of his life for 6 months. Whatever he's mixed up in now, you're not part of it." "But I am now, aren't I?" She met his eyes directly. "Because I'm here, because I overheard that conversation, because I'm talking to you." Jake's silence was answer enough. Sarah Chen stood at the crossroads she'd sensed earlier, but now she could see the paths clearly. She could walk away, drive to her grandmother's cabin, pretend this conversation never happened, return to a safe, controlled world of hospital shifts and predictable routines. Or she could step forward into whatever this was, dangerous, uncertain, but undeniably real in a way her life hadn't been for years. She thought of her patients, the children who faced impossible odds with courage that humbled her daily. They didn't get to choose safety. They faced their battles head-on, with whatever strength they could muster. "What happens now?" she asked. Jake's expression shifted, and she saw the exact moment he realized she wasn't walking away. "Now things get complicated." "Good," Sarah said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "I'm tired of simple." Jake studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah saw him wrestling with something that went beyond professional protocol. Finally, he pulled out his phone and typed a quick message before sliding it across the bar to her. "Text that number. Tell them you're Sarah Chen, that you were engaged to Marcus Hoffman, and that you need immediate protection." Sarah stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly as the reality of her situation crystallized. "Protection from what?" "From the fact that Marcus just saw you talking to me." Jake's voice was grim, and depending on how paranoid he's gotten, that conversation might have signed your death warrant. The words hit her like ice water. You're being dramatic. Am I? Jake leaned closer, his grey eyes intense. Think about what you know about Marcus, really know, not what he told you. Think about those late-night calls, the business trips that didn't quite add up, the money that seemed to appear from nowhere. Sarah's mind raced backward through their relationship, memories reshaping themselves under this new light. Marcus's sudden ability to afford expensive restaurants when his consulting business had supposedly been struggling. The way he'd insisted on handling all their financial planning, keeping her completely separate from his accounts for tax purposes. The friends who'd gradually disappeared from his life, replaced by business associates she'd never met. He was always careful about compartmentalization, she said slowly, said it was professional necessity in his line of work. It was. Just not the kind of profession you thought. The roadhouse door opened with a blast of cold air, and Sarah's heart lurched as two men entered, shaking rain from their jackets. They weren't law enforcement. Everything about their posture and scanning gaze screamed the opposite. Jake's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his jacket, a motion so subtle she might have missed it if terror hadn't sharpened her senses to supernatural clarity. "Bathroom," Jake murmured without moving his lips. "Back exit, now." Sarah slid off her bar stool with forced casualness, her nursing training kicking in the way it did during emergencies, external calm masking internal chaos. She walked toward the back of the bar with steady steps, hyper-aware of the weight of eyes following her movement. The bathroom was a cramped space that smelled of industrial cleaner and decades of cigarette smoke. Sarah fumbled for her phone, Jake's contact information still displayed on the screen, and typed the message with fingers that barely cooperated. Sarah Chen. Engaged to Marcus Hoffman. Need immediate protection. The response came back within seconds. Location. She was typing the roadhouse's name when she heard raised voices from the main room, followed by the unmistakable sound of furniture being overturned. Her blood turned to ice. "Roadhouse under attack," she added to her message, then looked frantically around the tiny space for options. The window was painted shut and too small anyway. The back exit Jake had mentioned must be through the main room, which was no longer safe territory. Her phone buzzed back up en route. "Stay hidden. Trust Morrison." Morrison. Sarah realized she didn't even know Jake's real name, had been trusting a complete stranger with her life, based on nothing more than instinct and desperation. The irony might have been funny if she weren't potentially about to die. A crash from the main room was followed by Jake's voice, pitched to carry, "Wrong place, wrong time, gentlemen. The lady already left." "Bullshit," came the response. "Marcus saw her talking to you." "Where is she?" Sarah pressed herself against the bathroom wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure it would give her away. These men knew Marcus. Had Marcus sent them? The thought that the man she'd once planned to marry might have ordered her death made bile rise in her throat. "Check the parking lot," Jake suggested, his tone conversational despite what sounded like at least two weapons being pointed at him. She seemed pretty eager to get out of here once the storm let up. "You think we're stupid?" Another voice, rougher than the first. "We know who you are, Morrison. FBI Golden Boy, 18 months deep in Kozlov's operation. You think we don't have people watching your every move?" Sarah's blood chilled. If these men knew Jake was FBI, if they knew about his investigation, then this wasn't random violence. This was execution. More furniture crashed, followed by Jake's voice again, tighter now. "Then you know killing a federal agent brings heat you can't imagine. Not if there's no body to find." Sarah closed her eyes, her mind racing through options, with the same systematic approach she used during medical emergencies. Stay hidden, and hope backup arrived before Jake was killed, try to help and likely get them both killed, or find a third option that didn't exist in her current reality. Then she remembered something Marcus used to say, "Sometimes the only way to win is to change the rules of the game." Sarah Chen, pediatric nurse who'd spent her life following rules and trusting authority, opened the bathroom door and stepped into chaos. The main room of the roadhouse looked like a war zone. Tables were overturned, chairs scattered, and Jake, Agent Morrison, stood in the center with his hands partially raised, flanked by two men whose weapons were trained on him with professional precision. The bartender was nowhere to be seen, probably fled through whatever back exit Sarah had missed. "Well, look who decided to join the party," the shorter of the two men said, swinging his gun toward her. "Sarah Chen, the nurse who knows too much." Sarah's medical training took over, the same hyper-awareness that helped her function during pediatric codes flooding her system. She catalogued details automatically, the taller man's slight limp favoring his left leg, the way the shorter one held his weapon, confident but not military-trained, the blood on Jake's split lip that meant this had already turned physical. "I don't know anything," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I just wanted to get out of the rain." "Cute," the shorter man said. But Marcus was very specific about what he saw. "You and the Fed here having a real cozy conversation about things that aren't your business." Jake's eyes met hers across the room, and she saw a flash of something. Approval? Warning? Before his expression returned to careful neutrality. "She's civilian. Kozlov won't want the attention that comes with—" "Kozlov's not calling the shots anymore," the taller man interrupted. "New management, new rules. Loose ends get cut." Sarah felt the shift in the room's energy, the way tension crystallized into imminent violence. In the pediatric ICU, she'd learned to recognize the moment when a situation moved beyond recovery, when all the careful monitoring and intervention couldn't prevent the inevitable. This felt the same, except instead of watching a child's vital signs crash, she was watching her own death approach. "You're right," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before conscious thought could stop them. "I do know things about Marcus, things that could help your investigation." Both men turned toward her, and Sarah caught Jake's almost imperceptible shake of his head. She ignored it. If she was going to die anyway, she might as well make it count. Marcus kept records. She lied smoothly, amazed at how natural deception felt when survival was at stake. Financial records, phone logs, meeting notes. He was paranoid about having leverage on everyone he worked with. "I know where he hid them." The shorter man lowered his weapon slightly. "You're lying." "Am I?" Sarah stepped further into the room, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run. "How do you think he stayed alive in your world for 18 months? Marcus doesn't trust anyone completely, including whoever you're working for now. He's got insurance." "Sarah, don't," Jake started, but the taller man cut him off with a gesture. "Let her talk." Sarah's mind raced, building the lie as she spoke, drawing on fragments of truth from her relationship with Marcus. "He has a storage unit in Billings, under his mother's maiden name, documents going back 2 years, including financial transfers and communication logs, with someone called Kozlov's replacement. It was a desperate gambit, buying time she hoped would be enough for backup to arrive. But as she spoke, she saw something shift in the shorter man's expression, recognition that suggested her fabricated details might be closer to truth than she'd dared hope. "The storage unit," the taller man said. "You have access?" "I have the key." Another lie, but delivered with the confidence she'd learned from watching Marcus manipulate situations for years. "But if anything happens to me, if I don't check in with specific people at specific times, that information goes public. Marcus taught me well about insurance policies." Jake was staring at her with something that might have been admiration or horror. She couldn't tell which. The two gunmen were looking at each other, having some silent communication that felt like her life hanging in the balance. "Here's what's going to happen," the shorter man finally said. "You're going to take us to that storage unit, all 3 of us, right now. The storm," Sarah started, "will provide excellent cover for what happens after we get what we need." Sarah felt the trap closing around her, realized that her desperate lie had only delayed the inevitable while making the situation exponentially more dangerous. But as they began moving toward the door, she caught sight of headlights cutting through the storm outside, multiple vehicles approaching fast. Jake saw them too, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly into readiness. "You might want to reconsider your timeline," he said quietly. The shorter man spun toward the windows just as the first black SUV skidded into the parking lot, followed by two more. Red and blue lights began strobing through the rain, and Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of tactical teams deploying. "Back up," Jake said unnecessarily. But instead of surrender, Sarah saw something cold and desperate settle over both men's faces. The taller one grabbed her arm, his grip bruising tight, while his partner pressed his weapon against Jake's head. "New plan," he said as federal agents began surrounding the building. "We're walking out of here, and they're our guarantee." The taller gunman's grip on Sarah's arm was like a vice, his fingers digging into her bicep with enough force to leave marks. Through the rain-streaked windows, she could see tactical officers taking positions behind their vehicles, red dots from laser sights dancing across the glass like deadly fireflies. "Move," he hissed, dragging her toward the front door while his partner kept the gun pressed against Jake's temple. "One wrong move from your Fed friends out there, and both of you die." Sarah's mind fractured into the same clinical calm that had carried her through countless pediatric emergencies, but this time the patient was herself. Her body moved mechanically while her brain catalogued options with desperate efficiency. The federal agents outside wouldn't risk a shot with hostages in play. Jake was too valuable an asset to lose, and she was an innocent civilian, which meant they were walking into a standoff that could last hours. Hours these men would use to extract information that didn't exist. "Sarah," Jake's voice was steady despite the weapon against his skull. "Whatever happens, remember what I told you about Marcus. Trust that." The shorter gunman backhanded him across the mouth, reopening the split on his lip. "Shut up." Nobody asked for a pep talk. As they reached the door, Sarah felt the full weight of her greatest fear crystallizing, not death, but helplessness. Her entire adult life had been built around control, around being the competent professional who saved others. Even her relationship with Marcus had been, in hindsight, an attempt to control her emotional life through careful planning and reasonable expectations. Now she was being dragged into chaos by forces she couldn't heal, couldn't fix, couldn't manage with charts and protocols. The cold mountain air hit her like a slap as they stepped onto the porch. Rain immediately soaked through her jacket, and she could taste the metallic tang of fear in her mouth. Floodlights blazed from multiple angles, turning the roadhouse parking lot into a harsh theatrical stage. "FBI!" The voice came amplified through a bullhorn. "Release the hostages and surrender." "Counteroffer," the taller man shouted back, his grip shifting to Sarah's throat. "Clear us a path to that black sedan, or I start sending out pieces of your undercover boy." Sarah felt the barrel of his backup weapon press against her ribs, and suddenly every survival instinct she'd suppressed during years of medical training roared to life. This wasn't a sterile hospital environment where following protocol ensured safety. This was primal violence, and all her careful rules meant nothing. "The storage unit story," Jake murmured, barely audible. They believed it because it's true. The words hit her like ice water. Her lie hadn't been a lie at all. Somehow she'd stumbled onto real information about Marcus's insurance policy, which meant these men would never let her live, regardless of what they found or didn't find. She was a liability who could expose their entire operation. "Move!" The shorter gunman shoved Jake forward, keeping the weapon trained on his head while scanning the tactical positions. "You, nurse, call out to them. Tell them we're walking to the car, and anyone who tries to be a hero gets both of you killed." Sarah's voice cracked as she shouted toward the lights. "Don't shoot! They have us both!" The response came immediately. "We see you. Nobody's going to get hurt if you just—" "Wrong answer!" The taller man's grip tightened on her throat, cutting off her air. Stars exploded behind her eyelids as panic flooded her system. She was going to die here, in this godforsaken parking lot, because she'd been stupid enough to think she could outsmart professional killers with desperate lies. Then Jake moved. It happened so fast Sarah's brain couldn't process the sequence. A sudden twist away from the gun at his temple, an elbow driven backward into the shorter man's solar plexus, a diving tackle that sent both men crashing into the roadhouse's wooden railing. The grip on Sarah's throat released as the taller gunman spun to help his partner. "Run!" Jake's voice cut through the chaos as he grappled with both men. "Sarah, run!" But her feet wouldn't obey. She stood frozen as gunshots erupted, muzzle flashes strobing through the rain. Jake cried out, clutching his shoulder, as blood bloomed across his jacket. The tactical teams were shouting, advancing with weapons raised, but the angles were all wrong. She was directly in their line of fire. The shorter gunman broke free from the tangle of bodies and grabbed her again, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Move, bitch!" This time, Sarah's training kicked in with crystalline clarity. She drove her knee upward into his groin with every ounce of strength she possessed, the same movement she'd learned in the self-defense classes Marcus had convinced her were unnecessary paranoia. As he doubled over, gasping, she grabbed the heavy glass ashtray from the porch table and brought it down on the back of his skull. The impact vibrated up her arms as he collapsed, and suddenly federal agents were everywhere, shouting commands and securing the scene. Sarah stood over the unconscious gunman, blood on her hands and the shattered remains of the ashtray at her feet, realizing she'd just crossed a line she never imagined she'd approach. She wasn't the same woman who'd walked into this roadhouse tonight seeking shelter from a storm. That woman had been afraid of confrontation, of making the wrong choice, of stepping outside her carefully constructed comfort zone. This woman had just beaten a man unconscious to save her own life, and she wasn't sure which version of herself terrified her more. The federal agents swarmed the scene with military precision, their shouts creating a cacophony of orders that seemed to echo from underwater. Sarah stood motionless, the shattered ashtray fragments crunching beneath her feet as paramedics rushed toward Jake's bleeding form. She watched them work with the detached fascination of someone observing her own life from outside her body. "Ma'am, we need you to step back." A young agent with kind eyes tried to guide her away from the unconscious gunman, but Sarah's legs had forgotten how to function. The blood on her hands was already congealing in the cold mountain air, and she stared at it with clinical interest, noting how different it looked from the controlled bleeding in surgical environments. "Sarah!" Jake's voice cut through her dissociation. He was sitting up despite the paramedics' protests, his shoulder bandaged but his eyes alert with something that looked like panic. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me." She turned toward him slowly, the movement requiring conscious effort. Everything felt disconnected, as if her body belonged to someone else. "You're bleeding. It's a graze, but we have a problem." Jake struggled to his feet, waving off the medical team. "The storage unit you mentioned, Marcus really has one, doesn't he?" The question penetrated the fog in Sarah's brain, and suddenly the full scope of their situation crashed over her like ice water. "I don't know. I was lying. I just said whatever. These guys believed you because they knew it was true." Jake moved toward her despite his injury, his face grim. "Which means Marcus has been playing both sides, and you're the only person who might know how to access his insurance policy." Agent Rodriguez appeared at Sarah's shoulder, his expression professionally sympathetic but urgent. "Miss Chen, I know this is overwhelming, but we need to debrief immediately what you've stumbled into tonight." "I haven't stumbled into anything." The words exploded out of Sarah with surprising force. "I came here to hide from a thunderstorm, not to become part of some federal investigation. I just wanted to disappear for a while, to figure out my life without Marcus controlling every decision." "Well, congratulations," Rodriguez said dryly, "because Marcus just became a federal fugitive, and you're now the primary witness in a human trafficking case that spans 3 states. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Human trafficking. 3 states, primary witness. Each phrase dismantled another piece of the careful, controlled life she'd been trying to rebuild since leaving Marcus. "I can't do this," she whispered, backing away from the circle of federal agents. "I'm not equipped for this kind of thing. I work with sick children. I follow protocols and medical procedures and established guidelines. I don't beat people unconscious with ashtrays." Jake caught her arm gently, his touch grounding her in reality. "Sarah, you don't have a choice anymore. The moment you walked into this roadhouse, the moment Marcus's people identified you as someone who might have information, you became part of this whether you wanted it or not." "But I don't have information," her voice cracked with desperation. "I don't know anything about storage units or financial records or whatever criminal empire Marcus was building. I thought he was a boring financial consultant who watched too much television and insisted on separate checking accounts." "The separate accounts," Rodriguez said suddenly, pulling out his phone. "Miss Chen, did Marcus ever give you access to any accounts, credit cards, joint savings, anything with his name on it?" Sarah's stomach dropped as understanding dawned. "He added me to his credit card last month, said it would help rebuild my credit after the divorce settlement costs." The agents exchanged glances that made Sarah's blood run cold. Rodriguez was already making a call, his voice urgent as he rattled off instructions about financial forensics and asset tracking. "Sarah." Jake's voice was gentle, but she could see the weight of knowledge in his eyes. "That credit card access makes you a legal signatory on Marcus's accounts. If he's been using those accounts to launder money for the trafficking operation, I'm an accessory," she finished, the words tasting like ashes. "Even though I didn't know, even though I never used the card, legally I'm connected to whatever he's done." The full scope of her trap crystallized with sickening clarity. She couldn't go back to her old life because Marcus's associates would always see her as a threat. She couldn't disappear because the federal government now considered her a material witness. And she couldn't trust anyone because the man she'd loved for 3 years had built their entire relationship on lies that were now threatening to destroy dozens of innocent lives. As if responding to her thoughts, Rodriguez ended his call and turned back to them with an expression that confirmed her worst fears. The accounts show transactions totaling over $2 million in the past 6 months. Wire transfers to shell companies in 4 different countries, all with Miss Chen's name attached as an authorized user. Sarah felt her knees buckle as the roadhouse parking lot tilted sideways. Jake caught her before she could fall, but even his solid presence couldn't stop the vertigo of watching her entire world collapse in real time. She was trapped, implicated, and utterly alone in a game whose rules she'd never learned to play. The weight of Jake's arms around her should have been comforting, but Sarah felt like she was drowning in quicksand. Every breath seemed to pull her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. $2 million, shell companies, her name attached to transactions she'd never authorized, never even known existed. "I need to sit down," she whispered, and Jake guided her to the hood of one of the federal vehicles, its engine still ticking as it cooled in the rain. Rodriguez approached with a tablet, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Chen, I'm going to show you some transaction records. I need you to tell me if you recognize any of the dates, amounts, or destinations." The screen filled with columns of numbers that might as well have been hieroglyphics. Sarah stared at them, trying to process the reality that her signature was legally attached to this digital trail of blood money. But as her eyes scanned the dates, a pattern began to emerge that made her stomach clench with recognition. "March 15th, she said slowly, pointing to a wire transfer for $47,000. "That's when Marcus surprised me with the weekend in Seattle, said he'd gotten a bonus at work and wanted to celebrate." Another date jumped out at her. "April 3rd, he took me to dinner at that expensive place downtown, the one where dinner costs more than I make in a week." Jake leaned closer, studying the screen over her shoulder. "He was celebrating successful transactions by treating you to expensive dates, using you as his unknowing alibi while he moved money for traffickers." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Every romantic gesture, every surprise trip, every expensive dinner had been Marcus celebrating another step in his criminal enterprise. She'd been his unwitting prop, the normal girlfriend who provided cover for his double life. "Oh God," she breathed, the memory surfacing with sickening clarity. The wine. He always ordered this specific wine on those dates. Some expensive bottle, he said, reminded him of success. I thought it was sweet, how sentimental he was about celebrating our relationship. He was celebrating all right, Rodriguez muttered, scrolling through more transactions, celebrating how well his money laundering operation was going. Sarah's hands began to shake as more pieces fell into place. Marcus's insistence on handling all their finances, his reluctance to let her meet his work colleagues, the way he'd always steered conversations away from specifics about his job. She'd attributed it all to his private nature, even found it refreshingly different from her ex-husband's need to control every aspect of her life. "I'm such an idiot," she whispered. 3 years and I never saw it. Never questioned why a financial consultant could afford a downtown penthouse and weekly trips to expensive restaurants. "You saw what he wanted you to see," Jake said quietly. "That's what makes him dangerous. He's good at creating whatever reality serves his purposes." But Sarah barely heard him. Her mind was racing backward through 3 years of carefully orchestrated deception, re-examining every memory through this new lens of understanding. The business trips that always seemed to coincide with her hospital's busiest periods. The phone calls he'd take in private, claiming they were about boring financial regulations. The way he'd always paid in cash when they traveled together. "The storage unit," she said suddenly, the realization hitting her like lightning. "I do know about it." Both men turned toward her with sharp attention. Rodriguez held his stylus poised over the tablet. "Not directly," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as the memory crystallized. "But Marcus's mother died 6 months ago, and he spent a weekend cleaning out her things. He kept talking about how paranoid she'd been about banks, how she'd hidden important documents in places only family would know about." She paused, the implications settling over her. "He used her maiden name for the storage unit because I suggested it. I told him it would be a sweet way to honor her memory." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah watched Jake and Rodriguez exchange a look that confirmed her worst suspicions. She hadn't just been Marcus's unwitting accomplice. She'd actively helped him construct his safety net. "Sarah," Jake said carefully, "do you remember her maiden name?" "Kowalski. Helen Kowalski." The words felt like a confession, each syllable another nail in her own coffin. "And I know which facility he used because we drove past it on the way back from the funeral. He made some comment about how convenient the location was." Rodriguez was already on his phone again, barking orders about search warrants and tactical teams, but Sarah could barely hear him over the roar of blood in her ears. She wasn't just trapped in Marcus's web, she'd helped him weave it. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah Chen understood that good intentions and careful planning meant nothing when the foundation of your reality was built on lies. She'd spent years believing she was healing from her controlling marriage, learning to trust again, building something real with someone who saw her as an equal partner. Instead, she'd been the perfect mark. The rain had stopped, but Sarah felt like she was still drowning. She sat in the back of the Federal Command vehicle, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like industrial detergent, watching agents coordinate the search warrant through bulletproof windows. The coffee someone had pressed into her hands had gone cold an hour ago, but she held the cup anyway, needing something solid to anchor her to reality. "You're not responsible for what he did." Jake's voice came from beside her, though she hadn't heard him get in. His shoulder was properly bandaged now, his leather jacket replaced with a FBI windbreaker that made him look like a completely different person. "Aren't I?" Sarah's voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I suggested the maiden name. I helped him honor his dead mother by creating the perfect hiding spot for evidence of human trafficking. You couldn't have known." She finally looked at him, and the concern in his eyes made something crack inside her chest. "Just stop trying to make me feel better about this. I spent 3 years with a man who was selling human beings, and I never once questioned where his money came from. What does that say about me?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the dim light from the command center's monitors. "It says you trusted someone who was an expert at being trustworthy. Marcus didn't accidentally choose you, Sarah. He targeted you specifically because you were recovering from a controlling marriage, because you were determined to give people the benefit of the doubt." The words should have been comforting, but they only highlighted how thoroughly she'd been played. Sarah set down the coffee cup and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to push back the headache building behind her temples. "The children," she whispered suddenly, and Jake went very still beside her. If Marcus was part of a trafficking ring, there were children involved, weren't there? While I was treating pediatric patients during the day, going home at night to a man who was destroying other children's lives. "Sarah, how many?" Her voice cut through his attempt to deflect. "How many children were hurt while I was playing house with a monster?" Rodriguez chose that moment to climb into the vehicle, his phone pressed to his ear and a grim expression on his weathered face. He ended the call and turned to them with the look of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "The storage unit's been cleaned out," he said without preamble. "Professional job. Sometime in the last 70 to 2 hours by the timestamps on the facility's security footage." Sarah felt the last of her hope crumble. He knew. Somehow Marcus knew I'd talked to you, and he destroyed the evidence. "Not destroyed," Rodriguez said carefully. "Moved. The footage shows 2 men and a panel van. They spent 4 hours moving boxes, but they were careful about it. This wasn't a disposal operation, it was a relocation. Which means he's planning to disappear completely," Jake said. "Whatever was in that storage unit was his insurance policy for starting over somewhere else." Sarah laughed, but the sound came out bitter and broken. "Of course he is. Marcus always has a backup plan. Multiple backup plans, actually. He used to say that successful people prepared for every contingency." She stood up abruptly, pacing the small confines of the command vehicle as pieces of a new understanding fell into place. "He's not running scared. He's executing a strategy he's probably had in place for years. And I'm the only loose end he hasn't tied up yet." The 2 men exchanged glances that confirmed her assessment was accurate. Rodriguez cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Chen, we're going to need to discuss witness protection options." "No." The word came out with a force that surprised all 3 of them. Sarah stopped pacing and faced the agents directly. "I'm not running, I'm not hiding, and I'm not spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder because I was too naive to see what was right in front of me." "Sarah, be realistic," Jake said gently. "Marcus's organization has resources we're still trying to map. Professional killers, financial networks, connections in multiple countries. You can't fight that alone." "I'm not alone." She looked between the 2 men, feeling something hardening inside her chest, like steel cooling in water. "I have you. I have the FBI. I have information about Marcus that even he doesn't know I possess." Rodriguez leaned forward with sudden interest. "What kind of information?" Sarah smiled for the first time in hours, and it was not a pleasant expression, the kind that comes from 3 years of being someone's girlfriend. "Marcus thinks he kept his work life and personal life separate, but nobody's that good at compartmentalization. I know his habits, his tells, his backup plans for his backup plans." She paused, meeting Jake's eyes directly. "And I know exactly how his mind works when he's cornered." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop playing defense," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Marcus used me as his unwitting accomplice for 3 years. Time to turn the tables and make me his worst nightmare instead." The silence that followed Sarah's declaration stretched like a taut wire, filled with the hum of electronic equipment and the distant murmur of agents coordinating search efforts. Jake studied her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every micro-expression, every tell that might reveal the fear she was fighting to suppress. "You're talking about making yourself bait," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Sarah, you have no idea what that entails." "Don't I?" She turned to face the bulletproof window, watching agents move through the roadhouse parking lot like pieces on a chessboard. I've been Marcus's bait for 3 years. The difference now is that I know it." Rodriguez pulled out his tablet, fingers flying across the screen. "What specifically are you proposing? Because if you think we're going to wire you up and send you into a meeting with a man who's killed federal witnesses before, Marcus doesn't kill people himself." Sarah's interruption was matter-of-fact, clinical. "He delegates violence the same way he delegates everything else that might dirty his hands, but he always maintains oversight, always keeps control of the situation." She paused, accessing memories that now felt like studying evidence. "He has a compulsion to tie up loose ends personally. It's not enough for him to know something is handled, he needs to witness it being handled." Jake moved closer, his presence both comforting and unsettling. "You're describing a psychological profile. How can you be certain?" "Because I lived with his need for control every day." Sarah's voice carried the weight of 3 years' worth of catalogued behaviors. "Marcus never throws anything away. He archives it, never burns bridges. He maintains them for future leverage, and he never, ever leaves important conversations to subordinates." She turned back to the two men, seeing her own certainty reflected in their growing attention. "He's not going to send someone else to deal with me because I represent too many variables. I know his personal routines, his private spaces, his emotional triggers. He'll want to handle this conversation himself because he needs to control the narrative." Rodriguez was typing rapidly now, pulling up files on his screen. "You're suggesting we use his psychological profile against him. Create a scenario where he feels compelled to make personal contact. I'm suggesting we give him what he wants most, the chance to prove he's smarter than everyone else in the room." Sarah felt a cold clarity settling over her, the same focused calm that helped her handle medical emergencies. Marcus's greatest weakness is his ego. He genuinely believes he can manipulate any situation to his advantage. Jake's expression had shifted from concern to something approaching professional respect. "What would that look like operationally?" "It starts with me doing something Marcus would never expect, taking initiative." Sarah began pacing again, but this time with purpose rather than anxiety. "For 3 years, I was the passive partner. I let him make plans, choose restaurants, control our social calendar. I was the perfect girlfriend who never questioned, never pushed boundaries, never demanded explanations. And now?" Rodriguez prompted. "Now, I become the woman who's figured out his game and wants to negotiate." Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Marcus always said the key to any successful negotiation was understanding what the other party really wanted. "He thinks I want safety, security, a chance to disappear quietly. Don't you?" Jake asked quietly. Sarah met his eyes directly, and for a moment the professional distance between them collapsed into something raw and honest. "I want those children to go home to their families. I want the women your investigation is trying to save to be free, and I want Marcus to understand that underestimating me was the biggest mistake of his criminal career." The conviction in her voice surprised all three of them. Rodriguez looked up from his tablet with something approaching admiration. "You're talking about a complete personality reversal, becoming someone Marcus has never seen before." "No," Sarah corrected. "I'm talking about becoming someone he never allowed me to be." She thought about the woman who'd walked into this roadhouse hours ago, running from a thunderstorm and a broken engagement. That version of herself felt like a stranger now. Marcus spent 3 years managing my reactions, steering my choices, ensuring I remained exactly the person he needed me to be, but that person was never real. She was just another one of his carefully constructed illusions. Jake stood slowly, favoring his injured shoulder. "What you're describing isn't just dangerous, Sarah. It's irreversible. Once you cross that line, once you commit to this kind of operation, there's no going back to your old life." Good. The word came out harder than she'd intended, carrying the weight of every compromised choice, every overlooked red flag, every moment she'd chosen willful blindness over difficult truth. Because my old life was built on lies anyway. She looked between the two federal agents, seeing her own transformation reflected in their expressions, The frightened witness they'd been protecting an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, more focused, infinitely more dangerous. When do we start? Rodriguez closed his tablet with a decisive snap. We start by understanding that what you're proposing has never been attempted by a civilian with zero operational training. His voice carried the weight of 20 years managing dangerous operations. The psychological manipulation you're describing requires weeks of preparation, months of behavioral conditioning. We don't have that luxury. Marcus won't wait months, Sarah countered, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. His entire operation is compromised. Every day he delays increases his risk exponentially. She moved to the command center's central monitor, studying the tactical displays with eyes that now saw patterns instead of chaos. He'll make contact within 48 hours because that's his operational sweet spot, long enough to assess variables, short enough to maintain control. Jake positioned himself beside her, close enough that she could smell the antiseptic from his bandages mixed with leather and gunpowder. Sarah, listen to me carefully. What you're describing isn't just psychological manipulation, it's warfare. Marcus has professional killers on his payroll. The moment he suspects you're working with us, you become a liability he'll eliminate without hesitation. Then we make sure he never suspects. Sarah pulled up the storage facility footage on the main screen, watching Marcus's associates move boxes with mechanical precision. Look at this operation. Everything documented, everything planned, everything executed with perfect efficiency. This isn't the work of someone who makes impulsive decisions. She pointed to specific timestamps on the security feed. 4 hours to clean out a storage unit that took months to fill. That level of organization requires advanced preparation, contingency protocols, predetermined extraction procedures. Her finger traced the movement patterns of the two men. Marcus didn't just know I'd talk to you. He's been planning for this exact scenario since the day he first used that storage unit. Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression shifting from skepticism to professional interest. You're saying he's been preparing for federal investigation? I'm saying Marcus has been preparing for betrayal. Sarah's voice carried the bitter understanding of someone who'd finally seen through years of careful deception. He never trusted me completely. Never trusted anyone completely. Every relationship in his life was constructed with exit strategies and damage control measures. She turned to face both men directly, feeling the weight of absolute certainty settling over her like armor. Which means he's already planned exactly how he wants to handle me. The only question is whether we let him execute that plan on his terms or force him to adapt to ours. Jake's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen and went very still. It's too late for theoretical discussions. He held up the phone so Sarah could see the text message. We need to talk. Meet me where we had our first real conversation. You have 2 hours. Come alone, or the nurse who treated you at Portland General learns what happens to people who complicate my business. The blood drained from Sarah's face as the implications hit her. Marcus hadn't just been monitoring her movements. He'd been tracking her entire support network, mapping every connection that mattered to her. The nurse at Portland General was Emma Rodriguez, a colleague who'd covered Sarah's shifts when she'd taken time off to be with Marcus during his supposed business emergencies. He's threatening Emma, she whispered, the professional calm she'd been maintaining finally cracking. She's 24 years old, Jake. She has a 6-month-old baby. She doesn't even know Marcus exists. Which is exactly why he chose her, Rodriguez said grimly, already mobilizing his team through rapid-fire phone calls. Maximum leverage, minimal risk to his operation. Classic intimidation protocol. Sarah's mind raced through the message's specific wording, analyzing each phrase for hidden meaning the way she'd learned to decode Marcus's communications over 3 years. Our first real conversation. He's talking about the night I told him about my divorce. We were at the waterfront park downtown, sitting on that bench overlooking the river. Her voice grew stronger as tactical understanding replaced emotional paralysis. It's a public location with multiple escape routes, minimal cover for surveillance teams, and enough ambient noise to defeat most recording equipment. Jake was already studying satellite imagery on his phone. It's also isolated enough after dark that any violence would go unnoticed until morning. Sarah, this isn't a negotiation meeting. It's an execution setup. We changed the parameters. Sarah moved to Rodriguez's tactical display, her hands steady as she pulled up street maps and traffic patterns. Marcus chose that location because he thinks he understands my psychological profile. The sentimental ex-girlfriend who walk into obvious danger to protect innocent people. She looked up at both men with eyes that had gone cold as winter steel. Time to show him exactly how wrong he is about who I've become. Rodriguez ended his phone call and turned to her with something approaching respect, mixed with deep concern. "What are you proposing?" Sarah smiled, and it was the expression of someone who'd finally stopped running from the truth about herself. "I'm proposing we give Marcus exactly what he's expecting, right up until the moment we don't. The confrontation." The waterfront park sat shrouded in evening mist, the river below churning with the day's accumulated rainfall. Sarah adjusted the nearly invisible earpiece one final time, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. 50 yards away, Marcus sat on their old bench, a solitary figure in an expensive coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Visual confirmation on primary target, Rodriguez's voice whispered through the comm. "Snipers are in position, but Sarah, remember, we can't move until he incriminates himself on the wire." She touched the recording device hidden beneath her jacket, a piece of technology so sophisticated it looked like a designer button. "Understood. 60 seconds. Jake's voice cut through the static, tighter with concern than professional protocol should have allowed. "He's not alone. Thermal imaging shows 2 additional heat signatures in the maintenance building to your east. Sarah, this is a kill box." "I know." Her response surprised them both with its calm certainty. Marcus never does anything without backup plans, but he also never delegates the important conversations. She began walking toward the bench, each step measured and deliberate. "He needs to be the smartest person in the room, which means he needs to handle me personally." The distance closed between them with dreamlike inevitability. Marcus looked up as she approached, and for a moment Sarah saw a flash of genuine surprise cross his features, the first authentic emotion she'd witnessed from him in 3 years. "You look different," he said, standing with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent considerable money on personal trainers and martial arts instruction. Prison orange would have been more appropriate, but this works too. Sarah stopped precisely 6 feet away, close enough for conversation but far enough to avoid any sudden physical contact. The positioning wasn't accidental. Jake had drilled her on tactical spacing until it became muscle memory. "Hello, Marcus, you wanted to talk." "I wanted to say goodbye properly." He gestured to the bench with mock courtesy. 3 years together deserves better than a text message breakup, don't you think? She remained standing, studying his face with eyes that now catalogued micro-expressions instead of searching for emotional connection. "This isn't about closure. You're here because your operation is compromised and you need to know exactly how much damage I can cause." Marcus's smile shifted almost imperceptibly, the practiced charm giving way to something colder and more calculating. "You've been talking to federal agents, Jacob Morrison specifically." Her name recognition showed on her face, and his smile widened. "Did you really think I wouldn't research the man my girlfriend was kissing in public? FBI Special Agent Jacob Morrison, 18 months undercover, current assignment classified but obviously related to organized crime infiltration." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, but she forced herself to maintain steady eye contact. "You're very well informed." "I'm very well connected," Marcus corrected. "Which brings us to the heart of our problem, Sarah. You've involved yourself in matters that extend far beyond a simple romantic misunderstanding." He began circling her slowly, like a predator assessing prey. "The storage unit, the financial records, the communications you've undoubtedly shared with your new federal friends. You've created quite a comprehensive case file against me." "Have I?" Sarah turned to keep him in sight, her movement fluid and controlled. "Because from where I'm standing, you've just confessed to monitoring federal investigations, conducting surveillance on law enforcement personnel, and maintaining organized criminal operations, all of which is being recorded by the FBI surveillance team currently positioned around this park." Marcus stopped moving, his expression shifting from predatory confidence to something approaching wariness. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Sarah pulled out her phone, showing him a text message from Rodriguez, all positions confirmed. "Recording active. Keep him talking. Your move, Marcus." The silence stretched between them, like a taut wire, filled with the distant sound of traffic and the lap of river water against concrete. Sarah could feel Jake's presence somewhere in the darkness, could sense Rodriguez's team moving into tighter formation around the park's perimeter. But her entire focus remained on the man who'd spent 3 years manipulating her into becoming an unwitting accomplice to human trafficking. "You think you're very clever," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying a new edge that made Sarah's skin crawl. "But you're still the same naive little nurse who needed a strong man to make decisions for her. You have no idea what forces you're playing with. Enlighten me." Sarah stepped closer, abandoning tactical distance in favor of psychological pressure. "Tell me about the children, Marcus. Tell me about the women your organization trafficked while I was planning our wedding." Something shifted in Marcus's eyes, a glimpse of the genuine monster hiding beneath years of careful social conditioning. "You want the truth, Sarah? The truth is that everything good in your life for the past 3 years existed because I allowed it to exist. Your job at the hospital, your apartment, your sense of safety and security, all of it was built on the foundation of my protection." He pulled a gun from inside his coat with smooth, practiced efficiency. "And now I'm withdrawing that protection." The click of safeties being released echoed through the park as Rodriguez's team responded to the weapon threat, but Sarah never took her eyes off Marcus's face. In that moment, she finally saw him clearly, not the charming businessman who'd swept her off her feet, but the hollow, predatory creature he'd always been underneath. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marcus frowned, momentarily thrown by her unexpected response. "Thank you for finally showing me who you really are." Sarah smiled with perfect, devastating calm, "because now I know exactly who I need to become to stop you." The words hung between them, like a challenge thrown down in an ancient arena. Marcus's grip on the gun tightened, his finger moving toward the trigger, but Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she did something that would have been impossible for the woman she'd been 3 days ago. She stepped forward. "You're going to kill me in a public park with federal agents watching?" Her voice carried a strange mixture of sadness and steel. "That's your master plan? The great Marcus Kellerman, reduced to crude violence because he finally met someone who wouldn't stay manipulated?" "Sarah, get back!" Jake's voice crackled through her earpiece, but she ignored it. Everything had crystallized into perfect, terrible clarity. Marcus would never stop, not until she was dead, not until everyone who could threaten his operation was eliminated. The only way to truly end this was to force him into a choice that would destroy him either way. "You want to know what I figured out, Marcus? It wasn't about the storage unit or the financial records." She took another step, now close enough to see the pupils of his eyes dilated with adrenaline and rage. It was about the children's drawings. His expression flickered, just for a second, but enough to confirm what she'd suspected. "What drawings?" "The ones you kept in your desk at home. I thought they were thank you cards from charity events." Sarah's smile was heartbreaking in its gentleness. They were pleas for help, weren't they? Little hands drawing pictures of home, of parents they'd been taken from, and you kept them like trophies. Marcus's mask slipped completely, revealing the void beneath. "Those children have better lives now than they ever would have had." "Stop!" The command came out with such absolute authority that Marcus actually stepped backward. "Don't you dare try to justify it. Not to me. Not anymore." Sarah reached slowly into her jacket, her movements deliberate and visible. Marcus tensed, but she pulled out not a weapon but a photograph. The picture of Emma Rodriguez holding her 6-month-old daughter that she'd taken from the hospital break room. "This is Emma, the nurse you threatened." She held the photograph steady despite the gun pointed at her chest. "She works double shifts to afford daycare. She's never hurt anyone in her entire life. She saves children for a living." "Sarah, what are you doing?" Marcus's voice carried a note of genuine confusion. This wasn't following any script he'd prepared for. "I'm making you choose." Sarah's voice was perfectly calm, perfectly clear. "You can shoot me right here, right now, and spend the rest of your life in federal prison while Rodriguez's team dismantles your entire operation. Or," she let the word hang in the air like a blade. "Or what?" Marcus demanded. "Or you let me walk away and I disappear. New identity, new life, complete silence about everything I've seen. Rodriguez gets nothing from me. Jake's investigation collapses. Your organization survives." Sarah's eyes never left his face, but Emma and her baby stay safe. Forever. The lie came so smoothly that for a moment Sarah almost believed it herself. But this was what sacrifice meant, not just risking her life, but risking her soul, becoming someone capable of lying with perfect conviction to save innocents she'd never met. "You're lying," Marcus said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Maybe, but can you afford to be wrong?" Sarah smiled with devastating gentleness. "You taught me something important, Marcus. You taught me that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to become something you never wanted to be." Through her earpiece, she could hear Rodriguez coordinating his team, Jake's voice tight with barely controlled panic as he realized what she was doing. She was forcing Marcus into an impossible position: kill her and guarantee his destruction, or let her live and spend forever wondering if she'd told the truth about the deal. The children, Marcus. Can you live with yourself if you're wrong? It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Everything he'd taught her about reading people and exploiting their weaknesses turned back against him. Because beneath all his careful construction of sociopathic control, Marcus still carried the remnants of whatever had made him human once upon a time. His hand began to shake almost imperceptibly. The gun wavered. And Sarah Chen, pediatric nurse from Portland, Oregon, discovered exactly what she was capable of when everything she'd ever believed about herself crumbled away. She wasn't the victim in this story anymore. She wasn't even the hero. She was something far more dangerous. She was someone who'd learned to sacrifice her own soul to save strangers, and found that the cost didn't matter as much as she'd always believed it would. "Choose," she whispered. Marcus lowered the gun. The moment Marcus lowered the gun, time seemed to fracture into crystalline fragments. Sarah watched the weapon drop to his side as if it were falling through molasses, each inch of descent marking another heartbeat she hadn't been certain she'd live to experience. Then the world exploded into motion. Rodriguez's team materialized from the shadows like avenging spirits, tactical lights cutting through the evening mist as they surrounded Marcus with military precision. "Federal agents, drop the weapon. Hands where we can see them." Marcus complied with the eerie calm of a man who'd always known this moment would arrive eventually. The gun clattered against concrete as he raised his hands, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Even in defeat, he was studying her, cataloguing this new version of the woman he thought he'd known completely. "Sarah!" Jake's voice cut through the controlled chaos as he emerged from behind the maintenance building, weapon drawn but trained safely downward. His face was a landscape of relief and something that looked dangerously close to terror. "Are you hurt? Did he—" "I'm fine." The words came out steady, but Sarah could feel hairline fractures beginning to spread through her composure like stress cracks in glass. "I'm fine," she repeated, as much to convince herself as him. Rodriguez approached Marcus with practiced efficiency, producing zip-tie restraints. "Marcus Kellerman, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit human trafficking, unlawful surveillance of federal agents, and threatening federal witnesses. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning faded into background noise as Sarah finally allowed herself to process what had just happened. She'd stood 6 feet from a loaded gun, held by a man who'd manipulated her for 3 years, and she'd won. not through violence or superior firepower, but through psychological warfare that would have been unthinkable to her a week ago. Jake was beside her now, his hands hovering uncertainly as if afraid she might shatter at his touch. "What you did, that was either the bravest or most insane thing I've ever witnessed. Probably both." "I learned from the best," she said, watching Marcus being led away in restraints. Even now, he moved with that infuriating confidence, as if this were merely a temporary setback rather than the complete destruction of his carefully constructed empire. 3 years with a master manipulator teaches you things about human nature you never wanted to know. Jake holstered his weapon and finally, carefully, placed his hands on her shoulders. "Are you sure you're okay? Because you're shaking." Sarah looked down at her hands and discovered he was right. The tremors were barely visible, but they were there. Her body's delayed reaction to the adrenaline crash she'd been holding at bay through pure force of will. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked, and heard the small, lost note that crept into her voice. "Marcus is finished. His organization, the trafficking ring, it's actually over. The immediate threat is neutralized," Rodriguez confirmed, approaching them with his phone pressed to his ear. "But taking down the full network will take months. Marcus was middle management at best. We'll need his cooperation to reach the people at the top." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What does that mean?" "It means you'll likely be called to testify when this goes to trial," Jake said gently. "It means witness protection might be necessary if the organization tries retaliation. It means your old life in Portland is over, Sarah, completely over." The finality of those words hit her like a physical blow. Her apartment, her job at the hospital, her routine morning coffee at the cafe down the street, all of it had been stripped away in the space of 4 days. She'd walked into that Roadhouse bar as pediatric nurse Sarah Chen, and she was walking out as someone else entirely, someone who could lie with devastating effectiveness, who could manipulate trained killers into backing down, who could sacrifice pieces of her own soul without flinching. "Who am I now?" she whispered, the question directed as much to herself as to Jake. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the harsh glare of the tactical lights. "You're someone who chose to risk everything to save people she'd never met. You're someone who turned her own trauma into a weapon against the forces that created it." His voice softened. "You're someone who's stronger than she ever imagined she could be." Sarah looked around the park, at the federal agents processing evidence, at Marcus being loaded into an unmarked van, at Jake whose undercover assignment was finally mercifully over. The mist was beginning to clear, revealing stars that had been hidden behind the cloud cover. "Emma and her baby," she said suddenly. "They're really safe now?" "They're really safe," Rodriguez confirmed. Marcus's threat was leverage, not operational necessity. With his arrest, any danger to civilian contacts is effectively neutralized. Sarah nodded, feeling something tight in her chest finally begin to loosen. She'd made the right choice. The cost had been everything she'd thought she wanted from life, but the price had been worth paying. For the first time in 3 years, she was free. The return. 3 months later, Sarah stood outside Portland General Hospital, watching the early shift nurses hurry through the employee entrance she'd once used every morning. The automatic doors opened and closed with mechanical precision, each cycle releasing fragments of the antiseptic and coffee smell that had defined her world for 6 years. She looked different now. Shorter hair, contacts instead of glasses, clothes that spoke of someone who'd learned to move through the world with calculated awareness rather than naive trust. But the deepest changes weren't visible to casual observation. They lived in the way she held her shoulders, the systematic scan of her surroundings every 30 seconds, the phone in her pocket programmed with emergency numbers she prayed she'd never need to use. "Having second thoughts?" Jake asked, emerging from the rental car with 2 cups of coffee. He'd been her shadow for the past month, officially assigned as her liaison during the transition to witness protection, unofficially something she was still afraid to define. "Just remembering," Sarah said, accepting the coffee. It was exactly the way she liked it, Cream, no sugar, a small kindness that somehow made the larger impossibility of her situation bearable. I used to stand in that break room every morning and complain about double shifts and difficult parents. I thought those were real problems. Through the hospital's ground floor windows, she could see the pediatric ward where she'd spent countless hours. The colourful murals on the walls, the comfortable chairs for exhausted parents, the small miracles and heartbreaking losses that had shaped her understanding of what mattered in life. All of it still existed, but without her. Her replacement, a cheerful recent graduate named Jennifer, had already been there 2 weeks. "Dr. Martinez agreed to meet with you," Jake said carefully. "But are you sure this is what you want?" Officially, Sarah Chen took a leave of absence for family reasons and then resigned. Unofficially, everyone assumes you had some kind of breakdown after your engagement ended. Showing up might raise questions neither of us can answer. Sarah understood the subtext. Her new identity was solid. Alexandra Morrison, relocated from Denver after witnessing a federal crime, but it wouldn't withstand serious scrutiny from people who'd known her intimately for years. This visit was dangerous, potentially catastrophic for the careful facade Rodriguez's team had constructed. "I need to say goodbye," she said simply, "to who I was, to the life I thought I wanted." They entered through the main lobby, Sarah's visitor badge feeling foreign after years of swiping her employee card with unconscious routine. The halls seemed smaller somehow, less significant than the stark corridors and hidden rooms where she'd spent the past month in federal debriefing sessions and psychological evaluation. Dr. Martinez was waiting in his office, looking older than Sarah remembered. The stress lines around his eyes spoke of long nights and difficult decisions, occupational hazards for a pediatric department head that she'd never fully appreciated when she was living them herself. Sarah. He stood carefully, as if uncertain whether she was real or hallucination. "When you called, we all thought you might be—" He gestured vaguely, unable to complete the sentence. "Dead?" Sarah asked with a gentleness that surprised them both. "I suppose that would have been easier to explain than the truth." She settled into the chair across from his desk, the same seat where they'd discussed difficult cases and career advancement opportunities, where he'd offered her the senior nurse position she'd been planning to accept before everything imploded. The distance between that conversation and this moment felt like centuries rather than months. "I can't tell you what happened," she said, watching his face carefully, "for legal reasons, and for your protection. But I needed you to know that it wasn't about the work. It wasn't about you or the team or anything we did here." Dr. Martinez leaned back in his chair, studying her with the clinical attention he usually reserved for complex diagnoses. He looked different, thinner, more, he searched for the right word, vigilant. Sarah almost smiled. Even now, surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of her former life, her eyes continued their automatic 30-second sweeps of the room. Exit points, potential weapons, blind spots where threats might emerge, skills she'd never needed as a pediatric nurse, but couldn't seem to abandon as a federal witness. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for everything you taught me about fighting for people who can't fight for themselves, about making impossible choices when lives are on the line, about sacrifice meaning something more than just giving up what you want." "Sarah, what exactly?" "I also wanted to tell you about Emma Rodriguez." She pulled out her phone, showing him a photo Jake had shared from the federal safe house where Emma and her daughter were beginning their new life under witness protection. "She's a pediatric nurse from Denver. Exceptional skills, incredible dedication. When you're ready to fill the senior position, Rodriguez can provide references." Dr. Martinez accepted the phone with obvious confusion, but Sarah could see the moment he shifted into professional evaluation mode. Even in the midst of personal crisis, he couldn't resist assessing potential talent for his department. "She's beautiful," he said, studying the image of Emma holding her daughter. "But Sarah, I still don't understand why you—" "She deserves a chance at the life I can't have anymore," Sarah said, standing to leave. And you deserve the truth about why I'm recommending her, even if I can't tell you what that truth is." She moved toward the door, Jake rising silently from his chair against the wall. At the threshold, she turned back one final time. "Take care of them, Dr. Martinez. The children, the families, the new nurses who think they understand what courage means. Teach them what you taught me, that sometimes the only way to save what matters is to become someone you never thought you could be." Outside in the parking lot, Jake was quiet for several minutes before speaking. "How do you feel?" Sarah considered the question as they drove away from the hospital, watching the familiar Portland skyline give way to the highway that would take them to their next destination. A small town in Montana where Alexandra Morrison would begin building a life among people who would never know what Sarah Chen had sacrificed to save children she'd never met. "Different," she said finally, "but not lost. Not anymore." The woman who'd walked into that Roadhouse bar 3 months ago had been running from her past, desperate to escape the suffocating control of a man she'd thought she loved. The woman leaving Portland now understood that sometimes the only way to truly escape was to become someone strong enough to fight back. She was going home, finally, the new beginning. 6 months later, Alexandra Morrison stood in the kitchen of a small house on the outskirts of Whitefish, Montana, watching snow fall through the window as she prepared morning coffee. The ritual had become sacred, measuring grounds with precise care, waiting for the kettle's whistle, the first taste that marked the beginning of another day in a life she was still learning to call her own. The house was modest, nothing like the Portland apartment Sarah Chen had once shared with Marcus. 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, windows that faced the mountains instead of city traffic. Every piece of furniture had been chosen deliberately, nothing carried forward from her previous existence except the skills that had saved her life and the memories that reminded her why survival mattered. "You're up early." Jake's voice came from the doorway, rough with sleep but warm, with the kind of familiarity that had grown between them, like something organic and surprising. He'd taken a teaching position at the regional FBI training center, officially to develop new undercover protocols, unofficially to stay close to the woman who'd become his anchor after 18 months of living as someone else. "Couldn't sleep," Sarah said, pouring him coffee without asking if he wanted it. 6 months of shared space had taught them each other's rhythms, the comfortable negotiation of 2 people who'd learned to trust gradually, carefully. "I kept thinking about Emma." Through her phone, she'd been following the success of the pediatric nurse who'd taken the Portland position Sarah had recommended. Emma Rodriguez, she'd reclaimed her maiden name, was thriving in ways that filled Sarah with fierce satisfaction. The children Marcus's organization had trafficked were receiving specialized medical care, their trauma treated by someone who understood survival from the inside out. "Good thoughts or worried thoughts?" Jake asked, settling beside her at the kitchen table they'd bought together 3 weeks ago. It was small enough to be practical, large enough to suggest permanence. "Grateful thoughts." Sarah wrapped her hands around her mug, letting the warmth seep through her palms. "She's helping kids heal from things that should never have happened to them. Everything we went through, everything we sacrificed, it's making a difference in ways we'll never see directly." Jake nodded, understanding the complex mathematics of their situation. Marcus's arrest had triggered the collapse of a trafficking network that spanned 4 states. Dozens of children had been recovered, hundreds of potential victims protected by the elimination of supply chains and safe houses. The ripple effects would continue for years, anonymous lives saved by actions taken in a misty park in Portland. "Rodriguez called yesterday," Jake said carefully. "Marcus is cooperating fully with prosecution. The trial should wrap up by spring." Sarah felt the familiar tension that accompanied any mention of her former fiancé. Marcus remained a shadow at the edges of her new life, his testimony and eventual incarceration a necessary precondition for her complete freedom. She'd learned to live with the uncertainty, but it never stopped feeling like a low-grade fever she couldn't shake. "Will I need to testify again?" "Probably not. Your deposition was comprehensive enough for conviction, but there might be appeals, other trials as they work through his associates." Jake's hand found hers across the table. We'll face whatever comes next together, if you want." The question in his voice made her look up from her coffee. For months, they'd been dancing around the possibility of something permanent, something that acknowledged they'd chosen each other not from desperation but from recognition. Two people who'd learned to be truthful about damage, honest about healing, careful with the fragile trust they'd built from shared secrets and parallel transformations. "I want," Sarah said simply, and watched relief bloom across his features. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now, covering the mountain landscape in pristine white that made everything look new and possible. Sarah thought about the pediatric nurse she'd been, the woman who'd believed safety meant avoiding risk, love meant surrendering control, strength meant never needing help from others. That woman had been necessary, but she'd also been incomplete. She'd never learned that real courage meant choosing to trust after betrayal, that real love meant accepting someone's whole truth instead of comfortable illusions, that real strength meant becoming someone you never imagined you could be. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said, surprising herself with the sudden urgency. "I love you. Not because you saved me, not because I need you for protection or security or any of the practical reasons that brought us together. I love you because when everything I thought I knew about myself fell apart, you helped me discover I was someone worth building a new life around." Jake's smile was soft and certain, carrying traces of the dangerous man who'd posed as a motorcycle gang member and the federal agent who'd risked his career to protect her, but mostly just revealing the person he'd always been underneath the necessary deceptions. "I love you too," he said, "all of you. Sarah and Alexandra and whoever you become next." Through the window, Sarah could see the mountains rising toward a sky that promised clearer weather ahead. She was home now, finally and completely, in a life built on truth instead of fear, shared instead of hidden, chosen instead of endured. The woman who'd begged a stranger to kiss her in a roadhouse bar had been running toward this moment without knowing it, toward the discovery that sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted was the only way to find everything you actually needed. She was ready for whatever came next.